Live from Washington, D.C., this is Balance of Power with Joe Matthew and Kailey Leinz.
There's 11 hours left to reach a trade deal with Canada. Welcome to Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. I'm Kailey Leinz in Washington, where once again, the clock is ticking to avert 50% tariffs on billions of dollars worth of Canadian goods. The final deal, as we understand it at this point, not yet out, but could result in lower tariffs on a number of Canadian products. We'll get the latest details from Bloomberg's Tyler Kendall at the White House in just a moment, who also will tell us about the new announcement from President Trump to try to lower beef prices, lowering ground beef tariffs, at least announcing it today. We'll talk more about the president's trip to South Carolina this hour, too, and look ahead to Monday when the Treasury Secretary, Scott Bessent, is planning to unveil the economic plans the U.S. has in store to try to rain economic D-Day on Iran. The former national security advisor in the first Trump administration, John Bolton, will join me later this hour for more on that. But first, let's get a look at these Friday markets as we close out the trading week. And for that, we turn to Matt Piper in New York. Hey, Matt.
Hey, Kailey. Yeah, closing out the trading week. It was a crazy week. Let's see how it goes. Things are definitely looking better today than at this time yesterday, at least when it comes to stocks. We do check the markets for you all day long here at Bloomberg. Right now, the Dow is up 432 points, or 0.8%. The S&P is up by 42 points. The Nasdaq is up 148. The Bloomberg Dollar Spot Index is down today 2 points at 1191. Bond markets are steady, but long-term yields are set to close the week at levels not seen in more than a decade after investors seemingly shrugged off that quickly done emergency intervention by the Treasury Department from this week. The 2-year yield right now is up 4 basis points. The 10-year up 2 basis points. So is the 30-year yield. Crude oil right now, Brent at $94 a barrel, WTI trading at $87 a barrel. Bitcoin topping $77,000, heading toward its biggest weekly rally in about 3 years. Bitcoin's exact price right now is $77,478. We are watching BJ's. The warehouse club chain's total second quarter revenue jumped 16% to $6.23 billion. The big picture, BJ's shares have increased slightly more than 1% since the beginning of the year. The stock, though, has declined 15% in the last year. BJ's stock right now is up nearly 5%. Speaking of shopping, Ross Stores is proving that people still love a bargain even when money is tight. The discount retailer raised its profit forecast for the second time this year. Same-store sales jumped 10%, marking the second straight quarter of double-digit growth. Now, that is quite different from Walmart's results just yesterday, which pointed to pressure on consumers. Ross shares right now up 5.7%. For on-demand news 24 hours a day, subscribe to Bloomberg News Now wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Matt Piper, and that's a Bloomberg Business Flash. Kailey.
All right, Matt, in New York, thank you so much. Here in Washington, but on Wall Street as well, we're all waiting to see if we do get final word from the White House or from Canadian officials that they have inked a trade agreement to avert higher tariffs going into place on billions of dollars of Canadian goods. Remember, the president punted the deadline by 3 days. That was supposed to happen earlier this week, but talks were going well. He allowed for an extension. The new expiration is at midnight. Of course, we could always see it punted again. That isn't unusual in this administration. Or we may see the announcement of a final agreement. Stay tuned. The announcement we got from President Trump instead had nothing to do with Canadian tariffs this morning. It had everything to do with tariffs on ground beef. As the president took to True Social to write, "I concluded a deal to substantially lower the price of ground beef for working American families." He says that for the next 90 days, the United States will allow up to 300,000 metric tons of product for ground beef to be imported with no out-of-quota tariff. We have a commitment that this beef will be sold at 25% below current market prices. So let's get more now on this from Bloomberg's Tyler Kendall, who is live at the White House. And Tyler, there's perhaps an attempt to solve one political issue here, higher prices at the grocery store, but could it create another political issue for the president and make American ranchers a bit upset?
That's a really good point, Kailey, considering that we've heard the president talk a lot about speaking to those farmers that have supported him in terms of the Canadian trade deal, as the U.S. is trying to perhaps bring down some trade barriers when it comes to certain agricultural and dairy products. In that discussion, we can get there and get to the Canada talks. But in terms of this beef movement action. A White House official does tell us that President Trump is expected to sign an executive order related to this in the next 1 or 2 weeks. And essentially the deal here is that foreign importers of beef have agreed that they will import their beef tariff-free, but they have to sell it at that lower 25% rate compared to market prices. We'll see how much of an impact it will ultimately have moving forward. We did get indications earlier this month that American consumers were starting to push back when it comes to higher prices of beef, actually an area in the economy where Americans have been bearing the brunt of that cost but haven't really been changing their consumer patterns. But I pulled some recent data. According to beef volumes for the 13 weeks ending in mid-July, they fell 0.3% from a year earlier. And that is actually considered to be very significant because this is the seasonal time of the year where beef prices actually go up because we're in between major holidays, July 4th and Labor Day. So Kailey, no doubt a bid by this White House to try to lower prices as they continue to play that defense on affordability.
We got to talk to the White House about timing the lawn work better. Poor Tyler's fighting against the man on the riding lawnmower behind her. I guess it's time to cut the grass, but maybe they could wait a few minutes because I have another question for you, Tyler. You mentioned the potential Canadian deal here. Do we have any sense of timing from the White House as to when or if that's going to be finalized today?
That is the number one question, and I can actually tell you now. You probably hear the sprinklers going, but I can tell you that I actually just walked by the U.S. Trade Representative's office, and there is a massive crowd of journalists because everybody's waiting for some sort of update as the USTR Jamieson Greer meets with this Canadian delegation for really these last-minute talks. We're coming down to the wire. The deadline is tonight at midnight. We have some reporting that the contours of the deal are taking shape. It does feel like we are on the brink of an agreement that very likely will lower those metal tariffs for steel and aluminum, potentially cut them in half to 25% from right now a rather high rate of 50%. But the reporting is indicating that maybe there could be a quota on this, as well as that it's going to apply at different levels for different derivative products. So that's one aspect to watch. The other, of course, Kailey, has to do with the auto tariffs, another big sticking point here. Our reporting indicates that the 25% tariff could come down to 15%. It also may apply differently compared to how much of the content is U.S. made versus Canadian made in the car. So we still got to see those details on paper to actually know these full contours, but feels like we're getting relatively closer.
All right, Bloomberg's Tyler Kendall live at the White House. I find myself wondering if a riding lawnmower might classify as an auto that would have tariffs applicable or not. Although, luckily, they did calm down for Tyler there. Absolute professional, Tyler. Thank you so much. And as we consider the tariffs that Canada may be willing to accept for the U.S., so long as they're lower than what they would face otherwise, this is a discussion that David Weston, the host of Wall Street Week here on Bloomberg, had with Chrystia Freeland this week, former Canadian finance minister and a special contributor to Wall Street Week. Here's part of their conversation.
I think it's a bad outcome for the United States as well. It's really important for people to recognize that you can lose by winning if you've defined winning in a way which is self-mutilating. I would say Brexit, the British decision to leave the EU, is a great historic example of losing by winning. And in this case, I think it's really important for Americans to understand that putting permanent tariffs on Canadian steel and on Canadian aluminum hurts U.S. manufacturing. These are inputs into the U.S. manufacturing sector, and you are choosing to make your own manufacturers weaker. The tariffs that were imposed in 2018, there have been a lot of academic studies on the impact, and the net impact was harming U.S. manufacturing. Aluminum tariffs, particularly self-harming, because aluminum is basically electricity in solid form. So the U.S. is basically imposing a tax on electricity.
Those of us who are covering trade negotiations have a tendency to focus on what points have been won, what points have been conceded. But ultimately, it's about the real economy, if I can say that, of the two countries, of Canada and the United States. If this tentative agreement were to go forward as it's now described, what would it mean for the economies of the United States and Canada? We're presumably for growth and for the enhancement of our industries and of our people. What does it mean for the real economy?
This agreement is really an agreement to restrict trade between Canada and the United States, which I don't think is in the interest of any country. having said that, the tariffs that had been looming over Canada have been a real sort of Damocles. Business hates uncertainty. When I was responsible for trade, when I was finance minister, what I always heard from businesses is we care less about the outcome than we care about having certainty. So I think business will be happy with the certainty. They'll be happy that these Smoot-Hawley tariffs have not gone into force this week. And I think you'll hear from business that, at least we seem to have some certainty on the 232 tariffs.
That was the former Canadian Finance Minister, Chrystia Freeland, alongside David Weston, the host of Bloomberg Wall Street Week. And you can find the full conversation on tonight's episode of Wall Street Week, which airs at 6 p.m. Eastern every Friday here on Bloomberg TV and radio. But here on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio, we want to take this conversation further as we turn to someone who is very familiar with the nuances of trade negotiations such as this. Sarah Bianchi is joining us now, Senior Managing Director at Evercore ISI and former Deputy U.S. Trade Representative in the Biden administration. Sarah, welcome back to Balance of Power. It's good to have you. As we consider what may be happening here in the final hours before this deadline, obviously looming at midnight behind closed doors, how much work might they still have yet to do? Or could what we see ultimately by the deadline just be a kind of broad outline of what a deal could look like with a lot of nuances yet to be ironed out?
Well, I think their goal is probably to get as much detail as they can. As you all were discussing, there's a lot of details in trade that matter a lot to industry. So whether it's quotas on steel, letting a certain amount in tariff-free, whether it's steel derivatives, all of these things are critical. My sense is they will try to iron out as many details as they can because again, those details matter for both countries, and I think they're critical to getting across the finish line. But they could leave some dotting I's and crossing T's. But there does seem to be a lot of momentum, which is always critical. And Ambassador Greer knows these issues cold. So my guess is that they will get some kind of agreement by the deadline, if not soon thereafter.
And knowing what at least has been reported about the agreement and obviously understanding that the final details have yet to be announced, is it shaping up to be to you like an agreement that is advantageous to both sides? Or do you agree with Chrystia Freeland's assessment that it could be a bad deal for both Canada and the U.S.?
Well, I think we want to see the details. I do think that there has been a lot of concern about the steel tariffs. The United States steelworkers also cover Canadian workers, so they're going to be aligned there. And there, as was mentioned, there were input. So the Trump administration has been very tough in terms of moving off on the steel tariffs. Some of that comes from the fact that they believe there was too many exemptions last time, including exempting Canada and Mexico entirely. So I think that it's in the details, but in general, the most important thing, as you noted, is for business is to have this certainty and to have these two trading partners that are very dependent on each other in many ways, to really have them working together in a unified way. That's critical for both economies.
Well, and as you mentioned, it's not just the consideration of Canada as a trading partner, but Mexico too. And I wonder, in your mind, what perhaps a bilateral agreement here might mean for separate negotiations happening with Mexico, and what it might mean, frankly, for odds of renewing in some form or fashion the USMCA agreement.
Well, I think Mexico is obviously watching these negotiations very clearly. They have their own set of conversations going on with the United States, but they too are very interested in relief on some of these 232s, in Mexico's case, particularly auto. So they'll be watching. I think will come quite quickly to the United States following this agreement to ask for a similar treatment. Whether that means we'll get an agreed upon USMCA, continuation extension for the duration. I think that's less clear. I think there's a lot of different issues to work out, whether it's transshipment, Chinese investment, a whole range of things. So these bilateral agreements don't necessarily mean that that everyone is going to jump on, this extension for USMCA, but either way, it's promising for all the trading partners involved.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned China specifically, Sarah. You obviously oversaw that relationship at the U.S. TR and worked closely on this issue. In light of the president's threat of economic D-Day against Iran and in his suggestion that basically any country that is facilitating or the transfer, the smuggling of, or the purchasing of oil from Iran could face severe economic consequences themselves, I wonder if you have an idea of what actually that could look like and what China's response may be if we were to, say, implement secondary sanctions or more sweeping tariffs on Chinese goods in retaliation, how quickly they could retaliate in turn, or if it's likely to make them compliant with what the U.S. wants when it comes to
Well, that is a challenge for the administration, is that they are very carefully trying to maintain this détente with China, particularly coming into the September 24th meeting with the president. And there are so many issues at stake between China and the United States right now, whether it is the safety of AI, whether it is export controls, rare earths. So they're going to have to be very delicate in terms of those negotiations, and that will factor in here as well. I think, although I don't think the Canada and Mexico specifically are the biggest fish to fry in terms of conversations with China, but really they need to be mindful of anything they do, as, again, neither leader really wants to disrupt this kind of fragile détente that exists right now.
Well, and if I could just press you further on China, are there limits to what the administration realistically would be able to do against China, knowing how easily China is able to pull the lever of rare earths and critical minerals, as we have seen in the past? I just wonder if that's the ultimate trump card, in addition to Xi getting ready to come to Washington in a few weeks, as you mentioned, that might rein in the worst of what the president might want to do here.
Yeah, I think, look, there's certainly, we did see the president pull back quite a bit last year from what were very high Chinese tariffs, partly because of the rare earth issue, where I think China, who studied this president quite closely, recognized that using its leverage would really help in those conversations. So certainly much more leverage than we saw, say, in Trump 1.0. The administration has been pretty aggressive in terms of trying to do things domestically and with allies and partners on rare earths. I think they have been creative there, but it is not an easy thing to solve. So I think they have to, they are bound in some way. That being said, we have seen them take some actions, whether it be the recent FCC actions around drones and robots. So they're not doing nothing, but I think everyone is just trying to feel their way through how much can get done without, again, blowing up what I think both sides want, which is, again, a fragile détente.
Sarah, we just have 30 seconds left, but when we consider the president's announcement today that he's lowering tariffs on ground beef imports, is that in some way an admission that the existence of tariffs makes prices higher for the American consumer?
Well, he tried to frame the conversation in terms of low levels of beef, but certainly it is. There's certainly the rising costs are a huge concern to the Americans and to voters, and in beef in particular. Look, there's trade-offs for the president. He is going to anger some in the agriculture industry. That was a choice he decided not to make earlier in the year, but I think as the midterms get closer, some of these price issues are of increasing sensitivity.
Sarah Bianchi of Evercore ISI, thanks for joining us.
It's 1:21 on Wall Street. I'm Matt Piper. Cue the final countdown like it's 1986. The song, of course. The final stretch of a jittery week on Wall Street is seeing stocks rising amid solid economic data. We check the markets for you all day long here at Bloomberg. Right now, the Dow is up 410 points. The S&P is up by 37. The Nasdaq is up 0.5%. or 124 points. Gold is up 2% at 46.80. The Philly Semiconductor Index is down 1% at 91.88. Brent crude is edging up again on this Friday, on course to extend a 5-day run of rising prices. Brent is trading at $94 a barrel. That's a level last seen nearly a month ago. WTI is at 87. Bitcoin still doing well at $77,251. From Bitcoin to AI, Samsung Electronics plans to return as much as $80 billion to investors this year, joining SK Hynix in sharing an AI windfall. Samsung shares right now are down 1%. SK Hynix is up 3%. And Nscale is seeking to raise as much as $3 billion in its U.S. IPO. It joins a rush of artificial intelligence data center companies tapping public market investors. For on-demand news 24 hours a day, subscribe to Bloomberg News Now, wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Matt Piper, and that's a Bloomberg Business Flash. Kailey.
All right, Matt Piper, thank you so much. In New York, I'm Kailey Leinz here in Washington, where President Trump will be leaving this afternoon or later this evening. He has a big rally tonight down in Myrtle Beach, South Carolina, where he'll be stumping for Darlene Graham, of course, the current senator from South Carolina, having taken over the seat on a temporary basis for her late brother, Lindsey Graham. But she is now running to replace him on a permanent basis. And she's in a runoff that is Tuesday, August 25th, up against the Congressman Ralph Norman, who, of course, is fresh off of a loss in the gubernatorial race, but did advance to the runoff in this Senate race. That is the horse that President Trump decided not to back. He is very much behind Darlene Graham, at least at this point, keeping in mind that President Trump did endorse ultimately 2 candidates in the gubernatorial race when his first endorsement didn't look like it was going to pan out. It's not just President Trump that's going to be down at this rally in Myrtle Beach for Graham tonight. There's also going to be the chair of the NRSC, Senator Tim Scott, is there. Another member of Senate leadership, John Barrasso, will be there as well. And while Darlene Graham does have those advocates, perhaps to her benefit, as well as the name recognition, she may be facing a bit more of a headwind after the debate against Ralph Norman earlier this week, in which she was asked a question as to whether Taiwan and the South China Sea are national security issues for the United States. And her response was, and I quote, "I'm not that informed on national security." So let's get more on this race and this presidential endorsement being tested in particular as we turn to our political panel here on Balance of Power. Rick Davis, a Bloomberg Politics contributor, Republican strategist, and Stonecourt Capital partner, is with me alongside Democratic strategist Sarah Mercer, partner at Brownstein, Hyatt, Farber, Schreck. Welcome to you both. Rick, if we could first kind of set the baseline here as to where Darlene Graham is in this race relative to Ralph Norman. How much did she set herself back with that response in the debate?
Yeah, I think prior to the debate, everybody would have said this was hers to lose. I think there's an instinct that she did as best she could to try and put this race in play. Now it's, I'd say, still very much advantage Darlene Graham, but I think she's made it a contest. And the fact that President Trump and the congressional delegations coming down to support her is indicative of the fact that this is a bit of a rescue mission. Probably not a lot of good polling even internally on this at this stage, but I don't think anybody who saw that debate didn't think that she needed some life support. So here they come. No telling whether or not this is going to be good or bad for Darlene Graham. When Donald Trump shows up, it's all about Donald Trump. And, but it's a definite signal to his supporters in the state to be for her.
Well, and we should keep in mind, obviously, Trump is throwing his support behind her. He endorsed her for this on a permanent basis quite early, just after the death of her brother and her taking over his seat in the Senate for the time being. And he likes those who he endorsed to win, obviously, Sarah. And we haven't seen necessarily a perfect track record on that. There's been a number of losses of Trump-endorsed candidates, including just this week in primaries in places like Florida. So how much do you see that as a factor in the president's participation in this rally tonight? That maybe it's less about her and more about the idea that if she wins, it reflects well on him.
I think you're exactly right. President Trump is a risk taker, and I really see this race as a test of his influence and his endorsement power. And I would imagine that he sees that as well. And he's not afraid to gamble. And he really has put all of his eggs in this basket. He also, plays loyalty politics and certainly sees that if Darlene Graham wins, that he's going to have a very loyal member of the Senate to him. And also, though, I wonder if he's able to defeat Ralph Norman, if that really divorces MAGA from the sort of place that many of us on the outside looking in see the trajectory of Republican politics going from the Tea Party to Freedom Caucus and to MAGA. If he's able to say, no, look, this is really about me. And her winning, I think, helps to solidify that narrative as well.
Well, as you used the phrase, all the eggs in one basket, Sarah, that hasn't been the case recently in South Carolina necessarily. Rick, we saw him endorse two candidates in the South Carolina gubernatorial runoff at the end of the day. Would you be surprised to hear President Trump maybe suggest Ralph Norman would be a perfectly fine senator as well, or does Norman's support for Nikki Haley early on in 2024 perhaps make that a non-possibility?
Yeah. Ralph Norman's been a bit of an irritant to Donald Trump throughout his current term, and I would be highly shocked if he watered down his endorsement of Darlene Graham, who, as Sarah said, he literally convinced her to run for the permanent seat on his own, probably against some of the wishes of the local Republican hierarchy in South Carolina, who thought it was great to have her serve out the term, but to open it up and have a real primary contest. So and you can even see it lining up now. I mean, Mark Sanford, who came in fourth, I think during the early stage of this special primary, who's no friend of Donald Trump's, endorsed Ralph Norman. So the anti-Trump crowd definitely embraces Ralph in this, and that's enough to scare Trump away from hedging his bets with a dual endorsement.
Well, obviously, all of this makes South Carolina very interesting in this cycle in 2026, but it's going to be especially interesting looking forward to 2028, as, of course, it's going first in the Democratic primary process in terms of the presidential contest in 2028. The DNC just recently decided this, and that's perhaps why it is extra interesting to see Pete Buttigieg making tracks there today as well, Sarah. He's going to campaign for Democrat Nancy LaCour, who's running in the 1st congressional district, but I would imagine it's not a coincidence that he finds himself in South Carolina now that we know the calendar.
Yeah, exactly. I see this as nothing but a step forward for Pete Buttigieg in looking at whether a path towards a presidential candidacy is viable for him. I also see him doing the same thing that we're seeing California Governor Gavin Newsom and AOC doing, which is really using these as opportunities to test messaging with Democrats and to see what might resonate in a 2028 presidential race for them individually as candidates, but for the Democratic Party more broadly.
Well, and so when we consider then what message will resonate in a state like South Carolina, there's a reason why they selected it to go first, Sarah, that they feel like demographically it's more representative of the base of the Democratic Party than, say, Iowa or New Hampshire. And I wonder who might be the best messenger to that kind of electorate, who you would expect to have strength there, if Pete Buttigieg is one of them, or that's exactly what he's working on.
I think that is still very much yet to be seen, but certainly Pete Buttigieg wants his name out there and wants to be talked about in that way, in the same way as I mentioned with AOC. Obviously, Gavin Newsom is doing that. He's got his podcast where he's testing a lot of messaging, having a lot of conversations. But I think we also, are looking to, other Democratic state governors, Josh Stein in North Carolina, Josh Shapiro in Pennsylvania, Andy Beshear in Kentucky. I think they all also are looking at what is their appeal to the Democratic base, and who is the Democratic base right now? I think that is also an important question that Democrats writ large are asking themselves, especially with the rise of the Democratic Socialist candidates who are winning in these primaries across the country.
Well, does that go for both sides, Rick? Are Republicans considering who their base is, at least when Donald Trump isn't on the ticket, in the same way that Democrats are right now?
Yeah, look, you always, especially in a primary of any kind, whether it's a off-year election like we're having now or a national election like we'll have next cycle, primaries are controlled by your base, right? I mean, it's not a fair fight. People just don't wander into a primary fight. And so, yeah, base politics is really critical. I would say, Democrats did something that nobody really, I thought, gave them credit for, is they blew out Iowa and New Hampshire as important states because they just didn't have the amount of black vote in them that they felt adequately described their base, which the black vote makes a large portion of it, and it is a huge advantage for them. And so when candidates look at where they want to play and how they're going to play, they have to now go through South Carolina, and it means they must be right with the African-American black vote in South Carolina. And I think that's what we see candidates like Buttigieg doing right now, is trying to figure out how to have that conversation and how much progress they can make with it.
Well, I mean, we're paying close attention to the results of primaries recently, including in Michigan, to the black vote, which was far less likely to support a socialist or a progressive like Abdul al-Sayed. And obviously, there's been a lot of talk about the work at which the far left has to do to try to bring that part of the party in line here. Just on socialism quickly, I want to mention a tweet that crossed from Congressman Tom Massey, who of course was ousted himself in his primary in Kentucky by a Trump-backed challenger. Referring to President Trump's decision to reduce tariffs on ground beef today, Massey says, "What a slap in the face to American cattlemen and consumers, worse than socialism." He says dumping foreign beef in U.S. markets can temporarily lower prices, but it won't incentivize American farmers to raise more beef. I wonder, Sarah, if you see with the president's move today that maybe he's addressing one political problem, higher prices, but creating another, backlash from America's heartland.
Yeah, I think there's I really think there's a question around whether the Democratic socialist agenda, is it socialism or is it populism? And it's just maybe just a different version of populism than the populism that we're seeing on the right. And, being pro-competitive, being, pro-American, I do think that there is a question today about whether, this trade-off of trying to lower prices on beef, which have been extraordinarily high and are really hurting the American consumer, this trade-off with farmers and ranchers, how that's going to play politically come November and then certainly come 2028.
Rick, we just have 30 seconds left. Did Trump just make his problems worse or better?
Yeah, look, he's been doing this throughout this term, kind of confusing what a Republican position would be with what a Trump position would be. And I think this point about it's all being about him is going to confuse the ideological pushback to the socialists, because there are some very similar policies of this administration with what a socialist would endorse.
All right, Rick Davis and Sarah Mercer, our political panel on this Friday on Balance of Power. Thank you both so much for joining me. And stick with us because an important conversation is still ahead. I'll be informed by the former national security advisor to President Trump in his first term. John Bolton is just ahead on Bloomberg TV and radio.
It's 1:40 on Wall Street. I'm Matt Piper. Stocks are bouncing back at the end of what has been a wild week. We do check stocks for you all day here at Bloomberg. Let's do that right now. The Dow is up 421 points, or 0.8%. The S&P is up by 33 points. The Nasdaq is up about 0.4, or 114 points. The Bloomberg Dollar Spot Index sits at 1191, where it has been all day. Oil prices essentially flat as the U.S. stepped up its economic threats toward Iran due to limited progress in talks between Washington and Tehran to open the Strait of Hormuz. Brent stands at $94 a barrel. WTI is at $87. Bitcoin topping $77,000, heading toward its biggest weekly rally since 2023. And the dollar hovered near its lowest since May. Bitcoin price right now, $77,483. Let's take a look at the yield. The 2-year yield is up 4 basis points. The 10-year yield is up 3 basis points. So is the 30-year yield. Minnesota Timberwolves and Lynx co-owner Mark Lohr has agreed to sell his controlling stake in the franchises to limited partner Mark Schad at a $4.5 billion value. The AP says it comes barely a year after his purchase was finalized. Across the pond, some high-profile names have to pay the publisher of the Daily Mail. Prince Harry, Elton John, and Liz Hurley are among those who have been ordered to make an initial payment of about $13 million, and it may wind up being double that They failed in their efforts to sue the publisher, which is Associated Newspapers, over allegations of phone hacking and intruding into their private lives between the years of 1993 and 2011. For on-demand news 24 hours a day, subscribe to Bloomberg News Now wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Matt Piper, and that's a Bloomberg Business Flash. Kailey.
All right, Matt Piper helping us close out the trading week. Thank you so much. He'll, of course, be back for more at the top of the next hour when Bloomberg Business Week Daily begins, where I'm sure there'll be more conversation about what happened in markets this week and how much of it was driven by the bond market and by the moves coming from the Treasury Department, with Scott Bessent's intervention in the long end, trying, of course, to bring long-term rates down. Of course, we could be getting even more news from Scott Bessent next week. He has promised that on Monday, he'll be outlining the details of the economic warfare that the U.S. is getting ready to wage against Iran. Remember, earlier this week, President Trump announced on Truth Social that economic D-Day, in his language, is coming for Iran, writing in part, quote, "It will be the most crushing economic operation ever taken against any country," and noting that it does matter to other countries, saying any country that allows its financial institutions, businesses, airports, or government entities to provide any type of lifeline to Iran will itself face tremendous economic consequences. The questions this raises, of course, are whether these countries, namely China, will be willing to cooperate with the United States on this, and of course, whether or not it ultimately would work, as kinetic action that the U.S. already has engaged in, an ongoing military blockade, of course, haven't been enough to unlock what is still a standstill at this point, even though President Trump repeatedly over the course of last month has suggested the U.S. is in control and perhaps Iran does want to make a deal. Listen.
Iran is broke, totally broke. I want to give them every last chance before decapitation. They want to make a deal, but they're not going to make the kind of a deal that I feel is necessary. We have possession, complete control of the Strait, and I like the idea of declaring it a territory.
So let's get another voice on what exactly is happening between the U.S. and Iran, and the likelihood that the U.S.'s available tools here are going to be enough to move the needle. As we welcome now here on Bloomberg TV and radio, John Bolton, the former national security advisor in the first Trump administration, also former U.S. ambassador to the UN under President George W. Bush. Ambassador Bolton, welcome back to Balance of Power. When you hear the president promising economic D-Day against Iran, is that a promise that he can actually make, and is it one that will bring Tehran to heel?
Well, I hope that's what he intends to do. Whether, in fact, that's what we see when the specifics are announced remains to be seen. Trump is often long on rhetoric and short on performance. I really do think Iran is in very difficult economic circumstances, but even before the attacks began at the end of February, its economy was in very bad shape. The attacks did very significant damage to its military-industrial complex, and the current blockade and earlier iterations of the blockade have certainly severely impacted its earnings on oil and related products. I mean, I think the problem we're in now is the president didn't think through what his objectives were, didn't take adequate steps. He's been on again, off again for months now, and I think the Iranians see weakness. They see his concern for the upcoming November elections, and they're trying to play off that. So what he says he's going to do and what he does are often different things, and we'll have to see if that applies here.
Okay, so if we game out the different scenarios here, Ambassador, if he does do what he says he is going to do, and he goes for the maximum economic pressure against Iran, do you expect that that would be met with greater military escalation on Iran's part, as we've seen reporting that the IRGC has been using this ceasefire period as time at which it can rebuild its own capabilities?
Well, I don't think ultimately the economic pressure is going to be enough. It's possible. I mean, imagine a circumstance where revenues are cut off long enough that the Revolutionary Guard finds it can't pay its Quds Force, can't pay its besieged militia, can't pay its other components. You know, after a while, when you pay a lot of guys with guns and then stop paying them, they may show up on your doorstep and say, hey, boss, where's the money? Causing further destabilization of the regime. You know, we shouldn't be in the position we're in now. The idea we've been at war for 6 months really is comical. We had 6 weeks of American and Israeli attacks on Iran that did do considerable damage that Trump stopped and allowed going back to really April when the Iranian regime began to reconstruct from the damage that was done during that initial round of attacks. I think the confusion in Trump's own mind has severely undercut the military pressure and the economic pressure we could and should have brought on Iran, which is why now elements of the regime, which is very fractured at the top, think time is on their side. They think Trump is under so much pressure because of the elections. I don't see at this point they have any incentive to do much of anything other than continue to try and dig out until the elections are over.
Well, it's one thing to consider the political pressure in the looming midterms, Ambassador. It's another for Iran to be looking at the reporting of the U.S.'s depleted munitions stockpiles. Do they have valid reason to believe that, frankly, that the U.S. is limited in terms of what kinetic activity it could pursue going forward? Is the economic option really the only one the president can really take at this point?
Well, I think if you look at these reports of shortages in U.S. munitions, it's principally on defensive munitions to try and bring down incoming ballistic missiles, in particular our Patriot systems. Of course, that's not the only way to prevent incoming missiles from hitting targets in Israel, the Arab countries, our own bases, obviously. One way to prevent that from happening is to destroy the missile launchers inside Iran, which we were on the way to doing when we stopped 6 weeks ago, or stopped after the first 6 weeks. So much of this problem, I think, is of the president's own making. I don't think anybody should doubt that we have the capability to bring overwhelming military force against Iran, and specifically just in one aspect, to bring military force to bear to open the Gulf Arab side of the Strait of Hormuz to get their petroleum and related products out into global markets. That seems to me that should be the corollary to the blockade and other sanctions. Stop Iran from earning money, but do more to help Arab producers get their products through the Strait of Hormuz.
Well, and to stop Iran from earning money, that in large part might depend on China, Ambassador, and especially considering that Xi Jinping is going to be here in the U.S. at the White House meeting with President Trump in a matter of weeks. Do you believe that this president is going to be willing to take aggressive action against China at this point? Why would China be compliant with what Trump wants here in terms of choking off Iran?
Well, what Trump will do in 6 weeks or so, I'll flip a coin, you flip a coin, and one of us may be right. The fact is our blockade against Iranian exports or imports through the Strait of Hormuz is extremely effective. Now, there's some oil on the water in tankers more or less on their way to China that Iran could derive some revenues from. They could put some oil in tank cars and try and get it out. They could try to ship some through the Caspian to Russia. But by and large, Iran's export route is through the Strait of Hormuz. And if we cut that off, it really doesn't matter what China thinks about it. There's just no oil coming out from Iran.
Well, I wonder what signal you think China may not be receiving, or may be receiving from the United States, not just on this issue, Ambassador, but also the actions from President Trump this week when it comes to pulling back or directing the Pentagon to reduce in scale the size of our joint military exercises with South Korea. Trump has been talking about his great relationship with Kim Jong-un and how he thought it would be a disrespectful sign for the North Koreans for the U.S. to engage in that kind of thing with South Korea, of course, our ally, a country at which we have thousands of troops stationed. But how should China be thinking that as well? I just wonder how you think that impacts U.S. positioning in the Pacific overall.
Well, I think it's a sign of weakness. I think it's a real signal that Trump still doesn't have a strategy for East Asia. You know, he canceled the counterpart of this annual joint exercise with South Korea back in 2018, and he did it without any foresight, without any planning, without getting any concession in return from North Korea. We were sitting at a table in Singapore at the first meeting between Trump and Kim Jong-un. Mike Pompeo, myself, John Kelly, then the White House Chief of Staff, were there with the president. And unbeknownst to us, unplanned to any extent, he came out and offered to cancel the exercise. and we got nothing for it then, and we'll get nothing for it now. It's a sign of Trump floundering around, looking for something. I don't know. Perhaps, as some have suggested, it was to distract from his problems with Iran. Perhaps it's part of his endless campaign for the Nobel Peace Prize. I can tell you it has no strategic basis whatever, and will produce no result good for either South Korea or the United States.
Well, and when we consider the president's characterizations that Kim Jong-un has been, to quote him, unthreatening and respectful, even though he does have nuclear weapons at his disposal, does that in some way also potentially signal to Tehran that there could be a world in which President Trump would be okay with Iran having nuclear weapons so long as they remain unthreatening? I just wonder if it undermines the message that the president has continually articulated, that the pursuit here is for Iran not to have a nuclear weapon.
Sure. Look, if you go back over history, there's been extensive cooperation between Iran and North Korea on nuclear weapons and on the ballistic missiles that could be used to deliver those weapons. And when they see Trump, as he did in his first week in office in the second term, call North Korea a nuclear power, which is a phrase that caused a lot of concern among our Asian allies when he voiced it, it sounds like he was accepting North Korea as a nuclear power, that he had given up the idea of denuclearizing the Korean peninsula. That just says to the Iranians that they should continue to pursue their strategic objective of getting nuclear weapons, because at that point, Trump may be less of a problem. I mean, this is the kind of consequence when the president speaks without any forethought at all. I'm not aware anybody in the U.S. government knew that his social media posting on Sunday ordering that the exercises be scaled back had been discussed with anybody else in the government.
Yeah, maybe not the Secretary of State or National Security Advisor, who, of course, is the same person, Marco Rubio. Before I let you go, Ambassador, how influential do you think Rubio is to all of these conversations right now? What role is he really serving for this president who has leaned heavily on envoys like Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner?
Well, I think Marco Rubio is really doing more of the job of national security advisor than he is the job of Secretary of State. Normally, when you would have high-level negotiations over Ukraine, over Iran, over North Korea, it would be the Secretary of State who conducted the negotiations. But Rubio has largely been absent from that. He has been the dominant factor in Venezuela and Cuba in this hemisphere, but not these other things. So it's a very strange arrangement where the Secretary of State is not out there doing those high-level negotiations. How much influence Rubio has on Trump is anybody's guess. In 2016, Rudy Giuliani was once asked by a reporter, "Does Trump ever listen to you?" And Rudy paused and said, yeah, about 20% of the time. So if Marco Rubio's average is over 20%, he's doing well.
All right, Ambassador, great to have you back on Balance of Power. Thank you for joining us. John Bolton, the former National Security Advisor in the first Trump administration, former U.S. Ambassador to the UN in the George W. Bush administration. Thank you for being here. Apologies to our audience on some of those audio difficulties we were having, but an important conversation, and I'll have more important conversations up ahead later today, 5 p.m. Eastern, for the late edition, right here on Bloomberg TV and Radio.